And welcome to this week's Struggle Cast. I'm Barry, your host. Well, we're finally getting to the CCC. I think I've been saying that for weeks, but we're here. And we're going to try a little something different. I think the last bit's been a little too stiff, so try to loosen up. So, how are you cats and kittens doing? I'm a day late on upload. I apologize. It's not like anybody's waiting on bated breath right now or violating any contracts, but I do apologize to the few listeners that we have. Just a lot going on this week. Nothing bad, just lots going on. So, but we're going to get into the CCC. We've discussed some of the programs, relocation, and we also discussed the Writers Project, which I still think is just fascinating. There's so much good music and history taken from that. And before we get too deep into this, we're going to get going, and then I just want to frame this, and one of the reasons I bring up this stuff, especially history, is, there are a lot of parallels constant through history. And so if you don't have to really study it, but at least be aware of it and understand some of the context of what's going on, you're better able to get a feel for what's playing out in present time. And, as divisive and at each other's throats we think things are now, and they are by all measure. A lot of it's self-inflicted wounds, but that's a podcast for a different time, I guess. However, what we're talking about is, a lot of pushback against what would be otherwise popular programs and things for people to do. It just sometimes falls away, right? So, anyway, what I'm getting at is, at the time, even as dire straits as we were in this country coming off the Dust Bowl and into the Depression, there was still a lot of pushback and fear from all angles that these programs were, too communist. And some, I'm going to, I'm coming to the table fair, you know what I mean? I'm trying to make a fair arguments, good faith, especially good faith arguments for the people. At the time there were those that, some were possibly legitimate concerns about safety and security and things of that nature. But the backdrop of what was going on at this time just can't be understated. It was at a collapse for working people, the Depression and the Dust Bowl. And at the same time, you'd had young men come back from World War I. And there's a great story about the Bonus Army that maybe we'll get into on its own separately. But if you don't know what the Bonus Army is, Google it. Check it out. It's a lot of veterans very unhappy with not having access to benefits and pensions, etc. That basically, kind of almost like the Occupy movement of the 2000s. Or 2000 teens, I guess, early 2000s, tens. But much like that movement, these soldiers and veterans just took over and set up camp in D.C. and then were forcibly removed. That's a great story that has got a lot to get into, but I'm just bringing it up as some background. There was a lot of problems, and then as you look to the rest of the world at the time, and those seeds were here, this is the rise and emergence of incredible nationalism and fascism throughout Europe, and the fears, and rightfully the fears that some of that could spread here, because there was definitely, as is today, a nationalist bent by certain, percentage of the population. So it's just amazing to me that we forget. And getting New Deal specific, they were getting shots from all sides, particularly the CCC, which we're about to get into, the Civilian Conservation Corps. In its inception and through its entire existence, lot of fire about that it had subversive leanings and leftist socialist ideas, but was wildly popular with the people. The political class, not as much, but we'll talk about in a minute. It got some surprising pushback that wasn't expected, at least from common, what you would consider common perspectives, I guess, looking backwards. All right. So a little bit about the CCC is that it was begun technically in 33. They started planting trees. On March 9th of 93, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, for those that don't know, called an emergency Congress into session. Imagine that. An emergency session to Congress to actually affect change and not only take responsibility, but notice that things are out of control and try to right them in a strategic manner. Even if it wasn't, credit where credit's due, but even if it wasn't always the best policy or practice, there's a lot to be said about at least, trying, right? So anyway, in the 32 election, FDR ran, and it was almost like a cry of help. The people, man, were suffering. So by 33, and at this emergency session of Congress, they enacted the CCC. So it began for unemployed, unmarried men between the ages of 18 and 25, and eventually expanded to 17 to 28. And it's good to note here, just because of what we were talking about at the bonus army earlier, they didn't allow veterans at this point. It did open back up for them, I want to say in 39, but that was a source of contention for quite a while. No, actually, I think it was earlier than 39. I'll check that here in a second when we get to that part. It's called foreshadowing. So, what's interesting is like those parallels of, just absolute red baiting and scaring to death of people, was the political. Now, thank God back then that unlike today, the dissemination of information wasn't such that people were just bombarded with bombastic hyperbole, non-stop, clickbaity, division sowers. Because, modern journalism, and I say this as someone that's worked in journalism, so I'm not taking shots at well, I guess I am taking shots at the industry, but I'm saying so from a fish that's been in and out of the bowl both. Much like social media, the news is, it's a monkey see, monkey do world. And so once social media and other people and a lot of money got involved in how to involve people, which is something that journalists have been trying to figure out for years, with clever headlines, etc., but really got put on hype when social media took over, right? Because everybody wants some clickbaity, saucy headline to get people involved, right? So it really took it to the next level. And the problem with that is, when you look back at the history, especially of journalism in the United States, that's happened before, not on the social media aspect, but, in the early 1900s, when you get into the muckrakers and the yellow journalism, and if you don't know that, look it up, the early William Randolph Hearst stuff. So we already knew the dangers of that type of behavior, and it's, and you go years and nobody cares. You sow enough, foment enough discord among people, it's easy to not trust anyone. And it only takes, and that's the double-edged sword of journalism. If you're going to do it, it's a thankless job, But if you do it right, it can be rewarding. You do it wrong, and you just set into motion the worst game of Jenga ever. It's going to tip and fall. And I think you did that. We've done that long enough now to where it causes quite a bit of distraction, but it also motivates and triggers, I hate to use that word, but, and not in the social way, but literally triggering aspects of the brain to respond to certain things. And, the news has taken it to another level with their saturation because, and I would argue that there's probably a lot of demographic reasons for that. The people that primarily watch and get their media from traditional sources tend to be in a certain demo that might be susceptible to that, where younger people obviously are susceptible. I don't know, I'm having a hard time talking to you guys. Too much coffee early in the morning. But the younger people are susceptible to that type of engagement through social media. And what's crazy is the same levels of boom, 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 nonstop barrage is going to the older demo as well, but through the old traditional media, which is dying. And I only all this has to do with the New Deal and the CCC, that the same arguments pretty much have been on the table now for 100 years. It's pretty insane almost. But wildly popular with the people. So, and I ran across one thing, and they started off a lot of it by renewing the forest. And we forget that it's hard for us to imagine. We think that only industrialization really did any damage, and that's such a fallacy. Our forest had already been, really touched by the early 1900s by logging and everything else. And yes, industrialization has to play a role in that, and trade, and it's just basic capital goods. There's also an attitude, I think, at that time, 19th century, that everything was a plenty, so you could never run out, right? It's unfathomable to think that a well can go dry if it's a great big well and so many people have been drinking at it, right? Easy to fall in, which kind of is how people fall today politically, is echo chambers and bubbles, and get their feelings all hurt when somebody doesn't have the same beliefs of them, instead of trying to figure out, okay, well, let me see how you got there. Just take a little advice. It's easier to meet people where they are and figure it out, instead of be judgy. And especially, don't blame people for the mistakes that your elected officials foment. And not everything in the old days is bad, not everything in the new days is great, right? So find what's great and change them out. And maybe society right now needs to maybe look backwards just a hair, just a little bit, if nothing else, at civility. And I know that's a dangerous statement, because things weren't always civil for everybody, and I don't mean that. I mean in the interpersonal ways of, if a man or a woman or a person of any sort is doing a job, respect that person. You know what I mean? There are no, the job shaming stuff. We've gotten to a point now, after a couple of decades, where everybody wants to graduate college or whatever their institution and become, they want a position, you know what I mean? And they don't want a job. And we can point that ire at the elite class that aren't making conditions great for workers. However, the workers have some responsibility too. And, by the way, I'm a big proponent of labor, but I'm also a big proponent of, you got to still grind it out and get it done. So, anywho's, sorry for that tangent. But so, what they really started at first was trying to rehab the forest and the natural grounds that were already a part of the United States federal government. And their estimation was between 33 and 42, they planted 3 billion trees. That is ridiculous. And if anybody's ever been to a state park or a national park and camped out, which hopefully you have, if you haven't, do so immediately. You're missing out. This is your legacy. These things, if you've seen the stonework or the statues of, I think they called him Iron Mike, the CCC kind of mascot. There's a lot of, I've seen those statues in Arkansas and at Georgia. I had a chance to visit FDR's, was it the Little White House in Warm Springs, I believe, in Georgia, where he used to vacation quite a bit, I guess medically or just for relaxation. Either way, beautiful places, and all of that work was done in this relatively short period of time, which again boggles the mind, and maybe we should talk about at some point what Eisenhower was able to accomplish in a relatively short period of time. It's not getting into the weeds with the politics and what was going on in the 50s, just at the amount of infrastructure that was created, and the amount of funding that was raised to do so, by a guy that, had a tax rate of damn near 90% on the upper 1%, but also was a 5-star general and, Supreme Allied Commander in World War II that, people respected. So, I mean, it made it really, and that's the cost of leadership too. If you have just kind of like FDR in the same vein with Ike, in my opinion, where they were so popular, even the people that would normally submarine their policies would not dare. I mean, it's just political suicide. They're just too wildly. How do you go against Ike when one of your biggest voting blocks were young men and women that were associated? Well, everyone in the United States was touched by World War II, and the guy that ended it favorably for us is now the president. So, the criticisms are going to be probably few and far between, right? But I digress. So once it got going, the CCC, these amazing work projects, reforestation, it's just it's just unbelievable, just the amount of stuff. Like, let me give you some numbers here. They erected almost 3,500 fire towers. They built almost 100,000 miles of fire roads through, before this, unpassable parts of the wilderness. 4.2 million man days fighting fires, 3 billion trees planted, 500 camps. Those 500 were just for soil erosion. A lot of people forget that coming off the Dust Bowl, the reason for the Dust Bowl was the over industrialization and over farming of the Midwest and the prairies, to it left the topsoil basically loose and loam, and the wind would come and pick it up, and it just destroyed everything. So, and that doesn't get, they don't get their props. We see the statues and we see dams and these natural wonders and campsites. Let's just talk about the soil erosion program that the CCC, I mean, this was so foundational to us in so many aspects. Being able to feed ourselves after a period of time that agricultural production in our breadbasket was nil. Our livestock, our agricultural goods grown, even the average farmer, and that bled into the World War II effort, much like everything else in the CCC, to where we had victory gardens at all to try to feed ourselves, because it's so important for us, that breadbasket. And so to be able to throw manpower and knowledge at getting that soil back to being, efficient, healthy, and productive was a huge deal. It's just unbelievable. Erosion was stopped on over 20 million acres of the most at risk, and at the time almost destroyed farmland, which also led to the drainage. And these were the hidden projects that you can see. Like, there were 84 million acres of land recovered in the wilderness because of drainage conservation and management alone from the CCC. It's unbelievable. You also forget that in lieu of the National Guard, or in addition to, in some instances, when we would have national and natural disasters, which have always been going on, it's not a new phenomenon. In 37, hold on, the Ohio River, which I have lived close to before in my life, flooded. And, one of these monstrous once-in-a-thousand-year floods. And in southern Indiana, it was the CCC. They saved lives and property immeasurable. They worked in the floods up and down the Ohio and the Mississippi valleys all through 37, and then immediately went and participated in the drainage and flood remediation work. There was a monster hurricane that same year in 38 that hit New England, which is insane. And there were 1 million sheep stranded in blizzards in Utah in a massive freak snowstorm. Weird weather apparently happened all the time in those same years in 36 to 37. And it was the CCC men, enrollees, that went through the snowdrifts and saved these 1 million sheep. Again, it can't be understated like how important this agricultural production was to our nation's. I mean, you got to remember that grown people were. Sorry, my phone's buzzing. People were having to go to bread lines and soup lines just to stay alive and get a meal. So it was paramount to be able to get food to people. And a lot of their efforts did that. And then it also gave a little bit of relaxation and made it easier for the average American to access their own national and state parks, their own public lands, which again are their legacy and their kids' and grandkids' legacy. The sociological impact of just what went on can't be understated, but it's really hard to judge. Now, there's tons of books, and then obviously you've got this clown with 2 thumbs right here talking about it, which means nothing. But so I suggest you look into it yourself and make your own judgments. It is something you could say sociologically is a lot of the people and young men that worked in different camps, a lot of them, a high percentage of them, stayed in those areas after leaving and after returning from the war. And it was never established as a permanent program. And so by the late 30s, this is what I was trying to allude to earlier, there was pushback in what we would consider to be primarily the left historically. The labor unions really were not happy and were worried that young men were going to be trained and educated for jobs, which at the time was kind of, the labor movement was a little strong. They thought their purveyance, not the federal government's. And so that's why the first part of the program in the CCC and large parts of the New Deal weren't necessarily job training off the bat because of that. And FDR, I think that administration went out of their way to respect, the labor organizations and their requests and wishes. But that doesn't mean there wasn't a massive pushback, again, from the labor union, which I wouldn't have guessed without the research. And then the nationalistic Red Scare McCarthyism that we did discuss a little bit in the last episode about the first hearings that kind of really were the predecessor to the McCarthy hearings in the 50s. This is when it got going, with all those dirty lefties were reading books and writing poetry and having narratives recorded from slaves and stuff. They were evil people. No, I'm joking. I'm being facetious, and that's not this podcast. That's another one, which is coming soon, and I'll link to you at some point. And this might be a good time to break. Hey, download it, subscribe, share it, do things. If you're on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, the like, the notify. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me everything's okay. Just give me a thumb. Whatever, bro. It doesn't matter. This kind of content's not really heavy in the algorithms. And if you're listening on one of the we're available on any podcasting service that you can think of. So if you're there, go ahead and just hit the follow button. There should be follow the links. You can go to the webpage, and if you're on YouTube, same thing. Donate to the page. Help keep it going, and we'll try to keep going on this. Back to the CCC. So a lot of pushback, and again, moving towards the drumbeats of war in 39, they started to scale back some things. So there was going to be, you knew a change was coming, and nobody was really sure what was going on. Much like today, there's a lot of pushback on programs. And again, you got to remember not everything, we forget that a lot of the people that lost money generationally during the Great Depression recouped it. A lot didn't, but that's another again. So up until this point, a lot of the camps, I guess I should get into the camp life. Generally camps like barracks, it was run very, almost like civilian military, I guess, which is not hard to, because that's the same way that we run any institutional structures like prisons, etc. Same thing, open air barracks, chow halls, maybe a recreation yard for exercise, which obviously these men did do and enjoyed their recreation time. And a lot of National Guard leadership was immediately mobilized to set up these camps, and had a large role in the CCC, because at the time the military and the Army particularly were the only organizations large enough to mobilize this mass of people. At the time of the inception, most of the need was needed west of the Mississippi, where the bulk of public lands, etc., were, but the bulk of the population was east of the Mississippi, so it kind of helped each other. Now, and this is a point that I've always gotten into, that I don't think they get the credit, for, there's a huge swath of the history world that are big World War II fanatics and fans. So what's interesting about that is the CCC was so, in my opinion, integral into being prepared for the dangers that lay ahead in the 40s. Europe was at war, by 40. It was an entirely different, overnight, everything changed. The administration obviously wasn't involved publicly in what we supported. Great Britain at that time, we were not investing soldiers. We were shipping relief, and a lot of our ships were being lost to Germans, and a lot were being attacked in provocative measures by the German Navy. Some of these instances right off the U.S. coast, but that's a different podcast. So the drums, the beats of war were going. So there was a little bit of a shift coming in the CCC to be prepared, and these men were already pretty much doing what is the first part of a military engagement, is getting in a sort of uniformity, figuratively and literally, I'm guessing, because they were supplied clothing, they marched, there was formation, a structure, of living in the barracks. You're away from home. You're kind of in this very high-powered, hard work, all or nothing camaraderie environment, which was probably the best benefit for the men at the time, especially considering what's coming. And you can never undervalue, and I wish that, that's a problem today if you watch any of the studies, is men seem to be more and more alienated and less able to identify and have camaraderie with others. That's another podcast as well. Y'all keep me on track on this, and maybe we'll talk about them. So there was a little bit of a change in 40 leading up to 41, and by late 41, or late summer of 41, we were already calling for the draft in 1940. So we were preparing. We knew we were headed. I think the administration and general knowledge, we knew we were going to war. We weren't publicly doing that or making any overt directions toward. So as we led up to war, the CC did suffer in the sense of, obviously, at the height of 300,000 men were pretty gone and being taken over, being re-regulated. And as I say, the program was winding down. By 41, late 41, there were only about 200,000 men left. And that's a third of the force. As unemployment, it was almost a victim of its own success. By driving the unemployment rate and driving up the middle class, or the burgeoning beginnings of what was the, I guess you would call, beta middle class, prior to World War II, and then obviously after World War II, you had the explosion of an American middle class, which everyone still looks back to without acknowledging that they only had that because they had labor unions and protections, and the pay that they received was commensurate with the work and the output and the production. Anyway, we're not going to get into that either. But I doubt there's any CEO people listening, so I doubt I'm making any enemies with this. But it is what it is. So as there was a questioning, a need, do we need to keep doing this? Do we need to keep supporting this program that isn't as necessary, and more men were being called up? When we were finally invaded in the bombing of Pearl Harbor, that was kind of it. The CCC kind of is like a more of a, it'll be more of a, it just kind of sputtered out versus a giant explosion. It ended with a whimper, not a bang. It just kind of slowly went away as we went and changed the direction of that training more towards getting young men ready to go to war, which they did. And my argument is the experiences they had in the CCC prepared them, not only us as a nation, individually, the men were better prepared to go and fight. They had less of a turnaround time to be prepared, whereas, young men that were coming straight from the street, there's a certain amount of training to get them into soldier shape, and at least basic, hence basic training, just enough knowledge to be functional in a military environment. The CCC men were correct. They were ready. Not only that, the idea, the mass mobilization over a 5-year period that put 300,000 men tactically doing what can look back on now and see the productivity that they had and the things they left behind, that went into this and just, crushed it. So our lessons in how to make that happen, I think, really, really gave us the leg up and an advantage on, the Pacific and the European theater, particularly probably the European theater, immediately. And, that's it's a very fascinating part of history. Now let's get on. We're going to try to tie this off because I've got to go. There's still a lot going on. At the time up until World War II, there were no jobs, farms were being abandoned, businesses were bankrupt, and in 5 years leading up to World War II, and then you can't stage. I mean, you really couldn't. This is going to sound horrible in so many ways, but planned it better. If you're going to have your crash to the bottom and you're building up, you've already 5 years into the build, then get the war machine cranking in a just fight in World War II, where industry just goes to the next level. Technology and innovation go to the next level almost overnight. It's amazing. So after World War II, it kind of switched, and by '64 it became kind of like the Student Conservation Program, the Youth Conservation Corps, which it was a Hubert Humphrey thing from originally in Minnesota, and it came out of, by '65, the Kennedy's. Well, actually, let's give credit. It was Johnson's War on Poverty that led to, in '65, the rebranding as a training program specifically as the Job Corps, which is still around today. So that's a brief overview of the CCC. I really invite you to go and find out more on your own. It's just a fantastic part of history that has so many parallels till today. And this has been the Struggle Cast. Don't forget, please like, subscribe, download, do whatever those things are that are necessary to make other people like me. And we'll try to get this one back out on schedule next week. We'll be dropping on a Thursday, not a Friday. So y'all stick with us. Thanks for sticking around at the Struggle Cast. And we're going to go on to another style. I'm going to drop a About Me video at some point between now and next week. And also, I'm going to work a little bit of my own hot takes in with history starting next Thursday. So if you're interested, stay tuned, and we'll get to you. This has been Barry. Y'all have been awesome. Please try to be nice to people. Help your fellow man, especially working people around the world. They need your help right now. A lot of people are doing bad. So just, if you can, try to help somebody. It's all good. Build that karma. Y'all be good. Peace.